book of Hebrews, chapter 11, our fifth attempt to get it done. We've started this particular section. It's a long paragraph, so I've just divided it up into sections. This one is verses 23 through 31, so we'll just go through and analyze what we haven't finished yet. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents. It's their faith that's under consideration, not his. They hid Moses. They were supposed to have drowned him. Instead, they wanted to keep him alive. They hid him because they saw he was a beautiful child. The language is very obscure. It's like you look at the baby and the baby was pretty. Every mama that looks at a baby, her baby at least, thinks it's pretty. And that was the case, I'm sure, with Moses. The word beautiful, however, means he was exceedingly fair. That's the way the Greek word is translated in Acts chapter 7 and verse 20. Exceedingly fair. According to the New King James Version, that same word now is translated was well-pleasing to God. So the notion that we are to get from this is that Moses was hidden by his parents because they believed that he was God's child. He was there for a reason. He was there. He had a mission. How the Lord let them know that, I don't know. But apparently there was something about Moses that enabled them to know that God had a work for him to do during his lifetime. Therefore, instead of allowing the child to be put to death, they risked their own life and spared the child. We're told they were not afraid of the king's command. I'm sure they were afraid of the king's command. The penalty for what they did was death. And I would assume the meaning would be they weren't as afraid of the king as they were of God. Their reverence for God outweighed their fear of the king, and therefore they did the right thing. Having fear isn't a sign of a lack of faith or weakness. Having fear and allowing fear to control us, that's a sign of a lack of faith or weakness. Everybody has fear whenever we encounter troubles of various sorts. What matters is what do we do? Do we do the right thing? Do we overcome our fear and do what we ought to do, or do we allow fear to control us? Okay, that's what makes the difference. It's a lot like temptation and sin. Temptation isn't a sin. Everybody's tempted. It's what we do when we're tempted. That's where sin is involved. If we allow temptation to control us, then we sin. If we don't allow temptation to dictate our behavior, then we've overcome temptation. The same thing is true here. You can be afraid. Now, what are you going to do? Are you going to do the wrong thing because your fear is so great? Or will you do the right thing in spite of the fear? I'm sure his parents were afraid. Most people are afraid of being put to death. And there was a very good chance they would get caught. Nevertheless, they did it because they thought it was the thing the Lord wanted them to do. And that's the faith that we're talking about. That's the kind of faith his parents had. They had enough faith to do the right thing. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, he was actually 40 years old, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose instead to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Let me go back and get that again. I thought there was something else. Moses, as you know, was raised in the palace of the Pharaoh. He could have been possibly the next Pharaoh. He gave it all up because of his Hebrew heritage, his faith, his belief in the God of the Hebrew people. He chunked it all just to be a part of the Hebrews and the promises that God made to them. Moses obviously had a great deal of faith. He gave it all up. He esteemed, which means to consider or to account. He esteemed the reproach of Christ. The reproach of Christ has to do with sufferings one must endure because of their association with God. If we have a true relationship with God, we're going to make enemies. That's the cold hard facts of life. There's no way to get around that. Our Lord said a disciple is not above his teacher. You're not better than me. That's what he's saying. A servant, you're not above your master. It is enough for a disciple to be like his teacher. That's the goal, right? To be like the teacher, and a servant like the master. Now, if they have called the master of the house Beelzebub, how much more will they call those of his household? Jesus is saying, if they called me the devil, what do you think they're going to call you? Okay? If you're like me and they call me the devil, what do you think they're going to call you? It's going to be the same thing. You're going to relive my life if you're like me. And that's something that we ought to expect. When I first became a preacher, when I first started trying to preach, people got angry with me sometimes. And that bothered me a lot. As a matter of fact, it bothered me so much, I went in the hospital one time because people would get angry. Man, they said some hateful things. And I was kind of goofy. I thought if you just preach the Bible, all the Christians will accept what the Bible says, and that'll be that. Well, that's not really the way it works in the real world. And I learned that lesson the hard way. I got very sick because Christians, everybody's supposed to like you. If you're a preacher, people are supposed to like you because of what you do and what you teach. People are supposed to like you. Christians, at least, I thought. And it doesn't work that way. Not in the real world. In the real world, you run across a whole bunch of them that dislike you if you do that. And that's something that we have to understand as Christians. If you are like Christ, people aren't going to like you because of it. He wasn't murdered because of what he did. He was murdered because of what he said. That's why they murdered him. He didn't harm anybody. He didn't steal anything from anybody. He wasn't trying to take the thunder away from the scribes and the Pharisees and the elders. That's not what he was all about. He minded his own business. He preached the Word of God, but other than that, he minded his own business. It wasn't what he did. It's what he said. It was what he believed. And because he believed it, said it, and taught it, or said it, people hated him. Ultimately, they murdered him. And that's what he's telling us. If you're like me, if you do what I did, if you believe the gospel and you teach the gospel, well, people are going to think of you just like they did me. And we know that Jesus, for the most part, was despised by human beings. Most people did not like this man. And ultimately, they murdered him. They crucified him. One point during his ministry, he said, "Woe to you when all men speak well of you." That's what I thought was supposed to happen when you're a Christian. And Jesus said, "Whoa, something's wrong. Everybody speaks well of you, something's wrong." Because that's what their fathers did with the false prophets. The true prophets of God were never accepted by the masses. Never. Go back and look. Most of them died very violent lives. They were hated. They were despised. They were chained. They were in prison. They were beaten. All kinds of things happened to God's prophets throughout the Old Testament. But then there were many, many, many more prophets that fared well among the people. Everybody liked him. He's the best preacher in the brotherhood. They give him a slap on the back. They paid him a big wage. They were just tickled pink with these preachers. Well, Jesus said, "Woe unto you if everybody speaks well of you, because the masses only speak well of the false, never the true. If you're like me, they'll call you Beelzebub. But if you're a false prophet, you will be accepted by the masses." And that takes a lot of pressure off of us. Now, that's not a license for us to be mean. We should never be mean. When we talk the gospel, we should always be very kind and compassionate, trying to understand the challenge so many people have of trying to appreciate the gospel, especially people who have been taught incorrectly. When I first started listening to preachers in the Lord's church, to be honest with you, I didn't care much for them. The things they said just didn't hit me right because, it's not supposed to be that way. It's supposed to be different than that. The way I was taught, or what my understanding was, is that a Christian person was just a humble person, didn't bother nobody, didn't argue with nobody, never just oppose someone. If somebody wanted to believe that, that's their business. I believe this, that's my business. That's the way I thought a Christian was. And I started listening to the preachers who were preaching the Bible, and what they said just didn't sit well. So I decided I'd start reading the Bible. I did, and lo and behold, they were saying what the Bible said. What are you going to do? Either you're going to throw the Bible away and have a religion of your own making, or you're going to live by the Bible and follow it. You got to do one or the other. And I figured I'd go with the Bible, and here we are today. It's hard on us when people don't like us. It's hard on us because all of us want to be liked. Problem is, if you stand with Jesus, it ain't gonna happen. And that's what Moses understood, and that's how Moses lived. He esteemed the reproach of Christ to be greater riches than all the treasures in Egypt. The promise of life beyond this world in the eyes of Moses was a greater thing, something to be valued more than being the Pharaoh of Egypt. For, or because, he looked to the reward. And that's what we all look to. That's what drew us to Christ, whether we want to admit it or not. That is what drew us to Christ. There is a reward, and we wanted the reward. We had a choice between life and death. We chose life, and we started pursuing it, and that's what holds our feet to the ground right now, is the reward, what's coming for us, whether it be the acceptance of God and eternal life. All of the reward is what holds our feet to the ground. That's why we remain faithful in the face of adversity, because we want God to be happy, and we want eternal life. Looking to that, we esteem the reproach of Christ to be greater riches than all the treasures this world has to offer. We do like Moses did. By faith, he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. He feared the wrath of the king. That's why he ran. The prince of Egypt was in trouble. On the news that night, headline was, the prince of Egypt kills one of Pharaoh's soldiers. When the king saw that, he couldn't have a prince out here running loose killing his soldiers. He was going to have to go get him. Moses knew that. Therefore, he took off. He feared. But he didn't fear the wrath of the king so much that he wouldn't stand up for what he believed. He was wrong in his belief, but by faith he took a stand. For he endured as seeing him who is invisible. He stayed the course. Why? Because it was as though he could see God himself. He could see God through the eye of faith. Through the eye of faith, he could see God, he could see the promises of God, and therefore, for that reason, he endured. It's just like we do. We see Christ through the eye of faith. Sometimes I can see him so clearly, it's almost like I could reach out and touch him. We see Christ through the eye of faith. When you know a person, my mother isn't here, but I can see my mother. She's gone. My daddy isn't here, but I can see my daddy. I know those people. I know what they're like. I know what makes them laugh. I know what makes them angry. I know what makes them concerned. And when things happen in my life, I can see them just as clear as day. Well, the same thing is true about the Lord. If we know Him that intimately, then we can see Him when things happen in our life. And that's what Moses was able to do. It was as though he could see God, even though God is invisible. Nevertheless, he could see Him through the eye of faith, and because he could see Him, he endured. He stayed the course. He toughed it out. He ran his race completely to the finish line. By faith, Moses kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood. Everything in his body surely told him to get the people out of Egypt as quickly as possible. But he didn't. God wanted him to institute the Passover that night as they left Egypt, and Moses took the time to keep the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch the Israelites. The Lord was going to take the life of the eldest, or the youngest, in each household without the blood of a lamb on the posts. Moses trusted God, so instead of heading for the hills, getting out of town while the getting was good, he stayed in Egypt, and they went through the action of the Passover, which to me, in my mind, that would have been so hard to do. By faith, they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. It's hard to get a picture in our minds of what that must have been like. The river was at flood stage that time of year. It would be at its deepest point. I'm not sure how many feet deep that would be, but it would be quite a few feet deep. It was very deep at that time. The water was rushing, and God parted the water. The water stood up on a heap on either side of them. They had to pass between the waters without being able to see to the right or the left. It would almost been like going through a tunnel. They had to pass between the waters on dry ground, hoping that the water wouldn't come back on them as they were passing through. There had to be a lot of anxiety as they passed through the sea. Nevertheless, they did it. And then the Egyptians, of course, who attempted to do so were drowned because the water collapsed on them. But can you imagine what it was like getting at least 2 million, more likely 3 to 4 million people across the river? I mean, that was quite an ordeal. Yeah. In a group. Yeah, sometimes I used to, when I see the river parted, I'd see a path where they'd go through one at a time. But like Michael said, more than likely, what God opened up, it could have been a quarter mile width. It had to be a lot in order to get that many people through. Otherwise, at 800 miles long, it was taking forever. So it was a very, very large parting. We don't know the particulars. What we do know is that all those people got across. No telling how many of them were being carried in hammocks and things like that. There were the old, the infirmed. It took a lot to move all those people out of Egypt, and they had the Egyptian army coming down on their backs. It was quite a time for the people. What I'm saying all that for is to emphasize this was not an easy thing for these people to do. It took a lot of faith to trust God and go through with it. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. Notice the word after. The walls of Jericho didn't fall down because the people believed they would. The walls fell down after they did what God told them to do. It wasn't just faith, it was faith plus their obedience. The walls didn't fall until they obeyed the command. Sin isn't remitted until a person obeys the command. You believe, then you have to obey the command to take away sin. They believed, and then they had to encircle the city in order for the walls of Jericho to fall down. And that's what the people did. They walked around the city for 7 days, and then miraculously the walls fell. In all these cases, by faith, he kept the Passover. By faith, they passed through the Red Sea. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down. In each case, faith did something. And if you go through this chapter, that's one of the things you're going to notice. By faith, somebody did something. And that's what the author wants everybody to understand. It's not just faith. It's by faith coupled with obedience, the blessing comes. It's always belief and obedience and blessing. And as you go through each one of these instances, and I think there's about 30-something of them, that's the situation in each case. It was because of their faith and what they did. By faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish in the city of Jericho. She was a Gentile, but she did not perish with those who did not believe. Why? She received the spies with peace. She didn't look at the spies of Israel as enemies. She looked at them as the friends of God. Therefore, she took them into her house and she hid them from her neighbors. Her neighbors would have considered her a traitor. She was a citizen of Jericho after all. And here she was harboring the enemy of the people of Jericho. From the eyes of her people, she would have been a Benedict Arnold. But in the eyes of God, she was a woman of faith. She believed these were God's people. She wanted to make God happy. Therefore, by her faith, she received the spies with peace. Therefore, she and her family did not perish because Jehovah protected her. She had confidence, conviction in God and His Word. The next section, section 6, we'll go through first and read the text. This will be verses 32 through 40. He starts summarizing. What more shall I say? In addition to everything I've offered, what more should I say? The time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, also of David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, attained promises, stopped the mouths of lions. They quenched the violence of fire, they escaped the edge of the sword. Out of weakness they were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to fight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonments. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were slain with a sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom this world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth. And all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us during the Christian era, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. We'll go back and analyze it, but there's not a lot to say, except in a few cases. What more shall I say? I've offered enough evidence already. Have I run out of evidence? Hardly the case. I've got a laundry list of examples I could pour out to you. The time would fail me. I don't have enough paper to tell you about the deeds of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and all the prophets. The book of Hebrews would be 200 pages longer than what it is if he wrote out the deeds of all these people. These are the ones who through faith, acting because of their conviction, their confidence in God, because they knew God could see them through, they were able to subdue kingdoms. They worked righteousness. They obtained promises. They stopped the mouths of lions. Of course, our minds go immediately to Daniel and company, or Daniel's friends, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword. Out of weakness were made strong. They were valiant in battle. They turned to fight the armies of the aliens. They were despised by the world. They lived very arduous lives, very difficult lives is what they had to live, and they did through faith. They did. Women received their dead raised to life. Many were tortured. They wouldn't accept deliverance. They could have been delivered. In most cases, you were offered a chance to be delivered from death if you would do whatever it was you were ordered to do. But these folks wouldn't do that because they wanted to obtain the eternal resurrection. They believed that even though they died today, there was a better world coming. And therefore, they went to the gallows for their faith. And the others, what about the mockings, their scourgings? Scourgings is being beaten. You got to keep in mind, too, the scourgings, according to the law of Moses, the scourgings couldn't exceed 40 licks. The practice of the Israelites was to give 39 to make sure they didn't cross the line. But that's a law that only pertained to the Israelites. The pagans, they didn't stop at 39 licks. They beat you until they got tired of beating you. And if you could ever see the body of a person who went through a beating like that, it would really get your attention. If you ever seen The Passion of the Christ, there was a movie they made called The Passion of the Christ, and there's a scene in there where the Lord was beaten with whip, and the beating he endured, I thought, of course, you could never get the full essence of it because you can't smell the blood. You don't sense the fear, the anxiety of the crowd as you watch a man who is truly dying. We know this is only an actor, and that's always in the back of your mind. But as you watched him being beaten, being scourged, you get a sense of what it was like when people were beaten that way, and it was horrible, horrible. Crucifixion, it's a word we use very lightly, but the word crucifixion is derived from two root words out of the Greek. It's ek crucifixion, which means out of crucifixion. Out of crucifixion comes the word excruciating. In order to depict what crucifixion was like, they coined this word excruciating, out of crucifixion. And today we use the word excruciating very lightly. But the root of the intent of the word to describe the sufferings of the crucifixion came forth that word. It was a science to people. At the time Jesus was crucified, they had been practicing crucifixion for about 500 years. It started in other nations, and it was a science. They learned how to beat people and not kill them. That was what they wanted to do, is make the pain last as long as possible. So they learned where to hit them so that they wouldn't damage vital organs too quickly. And they practiced it over the years so they could make a person live as long as possible through the crucifixion, or the scourging rather. A lot of times people, when they were scourged, they would hang there for maybe 3 or 4 days. And then they might be crucified and hang there on the tree for another 3 or 4 days. Because they had learned how to torture people and yet not kill them. Now Jesus died relatively easy, but I think there may have been other reasons for that. It's possible that he could have been scourged 2 different times. Once he was scourged because Pontius Pilate wanted to show the people. He said, "Behold the man." He didn't want to kill Jesus, so he had him sent out and he had him beaten. And they would have beaten him really good because Pilate was wanting the people to spare him. And he brought him back out and he said, "Behold, the man," thinking that they would say, "Oh, no, he's had enough. Let him go." That's what Pilate was hoping for. But they wouldn't let him go. They still hollered, "Crucify him." And that's when Pilate took a basin of water, washed his hands. He was clear of this ordeal. And he turned him over then to the guard that crucified people. And they took him and they beat him. So it appears that he may have been scourged 2 times before he was crucified. But then also, you got to keep in mind, Jesus had the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had spent all this time trying to persuade people to pursue eternal life rather than eternal condemnation. Jesus built hell. He knows what hell is because he's the one that created it. He created hell for the angels. He knew what an awful place it would be. And because of his knowledge of how awful hell was, and because of his knowledge of what he knew people could become if they only chose to, he pleaded with more passion than any person who has ever lived. He threw heart and soul into trying to work out the salvation of many, many people. But for the most part, he was rejected, and that was devastating to this man. His heart, some medical doctors think that his heart probably exploded within him before he died. I don't know. That's what some say. But it was a horrible way to die. Now, why did I say all that? These people knew that was coming. Deny Christ, and we'll let you go. I worked with a fellow one time. He said, them were idiots. I couldn't believe he said it, but he said it. He said, those people were idiots. Why would you say that about those people? All they had to do was deny Christ, and then when they turned them loose, go and ask for forgiveness. That's all you had to do. Well, it doesn't really work that way, but they were staring not only death, they were staring a terrible, terrible death in the face. Or they might have been staring the death of their son or daughter. They did that a lot too. They got the son or the daughter there. They're about ready to beat him real good. Deny Christ, or your son or your daughter is going to be beaten and then crucified. What are you going to do? It's one thing to give your own life. It's another thing to allow your son or your daughter to die. What are you going to do? That's what our author is saying. By faith, they withstood the mockings and the scourging. They took whatever they threw at them. They held their ground, and they endured it. Don't read it lightly. Don't take it lightly. Try and see in your mind as you read the text what these people actually went through by faith. That's what faith does. It shows us a lot about our own faith. I look into the mirror of the Scriptures, and I see the faith of these characters, what they went through, and then I look at me and I think, what would I do? What would I do in their place? Now, you can't just say, well, I do the right thing. That's easy to say. But, you know yourself just like I know myself. And take a good look in that mirror. And if you don't like what you see, go to work on it and build a faith that can help you endure horrible, horrible times. Almost unimaginable. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. Believed that's the way Isaiah died, being sawn in two. They were tempted, slain with the sword. How did they live? They didn't live the high life. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins. They were destitute, had nothing. They were afflicted by the elements, by man. They were tormented in a variety of different ways. They didn't live what we would call a very good life, of whom the world was not worthy. The world was not worthy of the presence of the scum of the earth. That's what the people saw. They saw the scum of the earth, and God said those people weren't worthy to be in the presence of such dignitaries. That's the way God envisioned his people. They wandered in deserts, mountains, dens, and caves of the earth. They didn't live in a house like I do. They didn't drive a minivan like I do. They lived in mountains and dens and caves. Sometimes I think I've got it hard, huh? Ooh, baby. Compared to them, we sure do. It's kind of makes you ashamed when you have a pity party for yourself, when you know what some people had to endure in their life. All these, having obtained a good testimony through faith. It was their confidence and conviction in the truthfulness of the God of heaven. Because of that, they obtained a good testimony, that of course coming from God. God held them up as examples worthy of our imitation, and yet they never received the promise. The promise was out there, but they never received the promise in their lifetime. Why? God having provided something better for us. The Christ was offered, of course, in this era. He is what you and I look to, is God's love for man. This is something those folks never saw. They didn't see God become a man and die on that cross. They didn't know in their wildest imagination, I would suppose, that God was going to do such a thing because he had such infinite love for mankind. This was something he determined to do at a particular time in history, and these folks were never privy to that promise. They should not be made perfect apart from us. They were forgiven, of course, when the Lord paid the price of sin, when his blood was shed. It flowed backwards, back to Adam, and those people who were found worthy by God, their sins were forgiven, were atoned for, and of course the blood of Christ flows forward for those who obey him today. That's the end of the 11th chapter. We'll stop right there. It's one of the mistakes I used to make, I still do once in a while, is reading too fast. It's not good to read too fast, I don't think. You got to take a little time and absorb it, and it's not so easy to do. You might be able to knock out 4 or 5 chapters reading in one setting, okay? And that's good to do sometimes, really, I think it is. But it's also good to more often, meditate on what you're reading. Think about what you're reading. Absorb it. Try to understand it. These aren't just words. These are words given to us by God for the purpose of helping us grow faith. Okay, through these words you and I can grow faith, but we've got to understand the meaning of the words. We've got to understand the essence of what God is saying. And all of us are capable of doing that. We just got to slow down and read a little slower. If you get one paragraph in your study session today, that's okay as long as you understand what that paragraph says. As long as you understand what God's communicating to you, that's fine. A paragraph, I mean, that's a mile in your walk from here to eternity. Tomorrow you do another paragraph. The next day another paragraph. I mean, whatever you can do during your particular study time, the thing to do is not just knock out so many words, but absorb the words. That means getting out a dictionary. Boy, that would help people so much if they would just get out a dictionary and look up the meaning of words. Words are vehicles by which we transmit thoughts from one mind to another. That sounds complicated. Ted's got a thought in his head. He wants to get that thought into my head. The vehicle we use to do that is words. Therefore, if he's trying to get a thought across to me, the words that he chooses to use all have a meaning. And it's important for me to understand the meaning of each of those words. If I understand what each of those words mean, then I understand the thought. If I understand the thought, then we have communication. You can read the Bible and you probably look at yourself and you find it to be true. Sometimes you read the Bible, you get up, you go your way, and then you realize you don't really know what you read. It's kind of in one ear and out the other. Well, that's not your fault. That's what all of us do if we don't take the time to meditate on what we're reading. You got to absorb it. Make those words become a part of you, and then they'll help you grow faith. And that's what you want to do. You want to grow faith. The bigger, the better.